G'day and welcome to the News Now, a podcast exploring the findings of the Digital News Report Australia 2024. I'm your host, Caroline Fisher, and in this seventh and final episode of our podcast, I'm talking with Dr Richard Fletcher, the Director of Research at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. He is the lead researcher on the Global Digital News Report project. Hello, Richard, and thank you for getting up so early in the UK to talk to us.
No problem.
Look, this podcast coincides with the global launch of the Digital News Report for 2024. Can you tell us a bit about the history of the project and why it started?
Sure, yeah. So the project started in 2012. I started working on the project in 2015, and we've repeated it every year since then. So it's a large study of audiences. It wasn't always as large as it is now. When we started, there were just 5 countries, and now we've sort of expanded out to 47 media markets this year. And I mean, I said I wasn't involved at the sort of genesis of the project, but I know from those who were that the sort of primary motivation at the time was just a sort of sense of surprise that there wasn't a sort of study already like this for such a huge industry that employs so many people across the world and generates so much sort of money and has obviously huge political importance. It seemed odd that there wasn't a sort of comparative study that tried to track these sort of basic trends, provide basic numbers on people's media use. And I think it sort of coincided with a kind of historic sort of attitude towards audiences. And I think as audiences became more important, as audiences became more central to how news organizations think about what they do, it sort of chimed with that and has grown accordingly.
Okay. So look, you say it's expanded from 5 to 47 countries. Is there further expansion? What about China or Russia?
Well, I mean, we are, of course, interested in expansion. Most of the markets we've looked at or added to the study in the last few years have been what is sometimes called the global south. So we started initially looking at the US and Europe and expanded within Europe, but we realized that this was not necessarily providing a sort of truly global picture of how people use news, and we were interested in the sort of differences we would find in different parts of the world. So, and I think, we still want to do more to better understand parts of the world outside of Europe. So if we expand, that's where we would like to do it.
There must be challenges, though. Some markets must be easier to, say, conduct a survey in than others.
Absolutely, and we have to balance that against our sort of interest in sort of other parts of the world. And I think we have to be sort of conscious of the fact that sort of, there are different sort of research infrastructures that we can tap into in different countries. In some countries, in some parts of the world, it's not possible to ask certain questions as part of research. And that's something we have to be mindful of as well, because we obviously want the study to be sort of comparable across different countries. And then we want to end up collecting the same data in different parts of the world.
How has the news industry and government responded to the report? I'm a researcher on this project as well, but it often seems to me that in many ways we're tracking the decline of the mainstream media, and sometimes the findings are quite negative. So does the news industry feel attacked or criticised, or do they find the data useful?
I think on the whole, the reaction is sort of, is a sort of positive one of sort of curiosity. I think a lot of the time, you're right, the findings can be uncomfortable, but I think there's also a sort of strong desire to actually sort of better understand audiences and how they feel about the news, how they behave, so that people who work for news organizations can make sort of better decisions. And the sort of the most common question we get asked is, oh, well, have you got data on X or have you got data on Y? And that's quite sort of rewarding. I mean, I said there are times when people sort of don't like the results. And then there are cases as well where sort of findings can be kind of misused and abused, which we try to sort of push back on. But overall, I think people put the data to good use, and it's quite rewarding, for example, when you see sort of efforts and changes or initiatives from news organizations that are in some way or sort of partly a response to something we found. And also the same with policy as well. We see the work being referred to in sort of policy documents, white papers, etc., and that can be rewarding.
Okay, so I mean, when we look at the global data, it seems that many media markets are struggling with similar problems to the ones in Australia. There's been declining advertising revenues, a big drop-off in referrals from social media. Are these impacts being felt uniformly across the 47 markets in the survey?
But it's certainly true that Australia isn't alone in experiencing some of these trends. I mean, I wouldn't quite say they're sort of universal, but we see sort of elements of them to different extents in most of the markets that we look at. But as I said, the scale of the impact tends to vary. And I think, just thinking about, for example, the sort of drop off in referrals from social media, that depends, on how widely social media is used for news in different parts of the world. And we know that can vary quite a lot. So if you look at countries in sort of Northern Europe, for example, news organizations there tend to have a much sort of stronger direct connection. So in other words, people, when they're accessing news online, they tend to go straight to the sort of branded websites or apps of those news organizations, whereas in other parts of the world, people go via search engines, they go via social media rather than going direct. And I think you can easily see how sort of platform changes in those countries where there's a stronger dependence on platforms will ultimately have a sort of bigger effect on news organizations that are based in those markets.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we notice every year is that those Nordic countries, this cluster of Nordic countries where they have the highest trust, the highest interest, the highest consumption of news, what's that about?
It's a good question, and I wish we had a sort of simple, sort of clear answer to that. I think in part it's about sort of strong brands. So in these countries, they've had a long tradition of high levels of newspaper consumption, well-funded public broadcasting, for example. And I think that sort of legacy, which has sort of built up certain sort of brands and certain titles in the minds of the public, they've been able to sort of transfer that online, if that makes sense. And people, if they want to go to news, they remember these brands and then go direct as part of that. But I think at the same time, there's a lot of sort of other sort of possible reasons that sort of combine to create this, but it's certainly quite a strong trend we see in the data.
Yeah, that's right. Well, look, let's turn to this year's report. What are some of the key global findings for 2024?
Well, in addition to the findings around platforms that I've just mentioned, we spent some time in the project this year looking at AI in the news, so specifically how people feel about the use of AI in the newsroom for news production. And what we found was a sort of, perhaps unsurprisingly, a kind of level of sort of skepticism and a strong sense from audiences that sort of humans and human journalists, need to sort of be in control of the process. So people are a little more comfortable with the idea of sort of AI being sort of used to sort of help with kind of behind the scenes tasks, but they're a lot less comfortable with creating media from scratch, even with human oversight. That's especially true, I think, for topics like sort of politics and war, which are seen as more serious, and it's just more important in the minds of audiences to get it right on those topics.
Yeah. I mean, we certainly see that in the Australia data as well. And what about things like the global findings on trust, rates of consumption? Have they gone up or down this year globally?
We haven't seen much movement on some of those. I think in many ways, some of the sort of findings we have from this year are about sort of stability. So an example of that is that when we look at paying for news, in the last few years, we've seen that sort of subscription growth has stalled a bit. This isn't true in every sort of market we look at, but on average, that's what we find. On the other hand, we have seen this year a rise in what we call news avoidance compared to last year. So this is where people who consume news and are active news consumers, but they're also taking a conscious decision to step back or to limit their news consumption in some way. And we have seen that go up this year. And this is, in part, we think, due to what's prominent in the news at the moment. There's wars, and before that it was coronavirus that people were sort of trying to sort of limit their news consumption around.
In the global report, I think there's a phrase in there where it describes some of the changes in the social media sector as the great platform reset. What does the report mean by that?
I think what we were referring to there is a sort of general sense that this year is particularly important for understanding the role that platforms play in people's news use, and in particular how the sort of centrality of platforms may be sort of starting to change slightly. So in many countries, especially those outside of Europe and the US, we've seen a significant decline in the use of Facebook for news, which is still the most popular social media platform for news in many parts of the world, but it's clearly declining. And we've also at the same time seen that people are turning to a range of different social networks, or private messaging apps or video networks for news use. So one of the ways that we see platform news use fragmenting is that 6 platforms in our data now reach at least 10% of our respondents. But a decade ago, that was just 2. So people are using a wider range of platforms for news. And, we saw that increase this year. And we also see news use growing on YouTube, on TikTok, on WhatsApp. And this, we think is because news works very differently in these environments. We think this constitutes a change to the role of platforms in news. And I think on top of all that, it's clear that platforms have been adjusting their strategies in response to developments in generative AI. So, we've seen, for example, news organizations, striking up deals in some cases with generative AI companies. And we can think of these as a kind of platform. And in some cases, generative AI will be incorporated into platforms, search engines. And this again, we think sort of is the sort of start of a kind of move into a sort of a different phase of news consumption where platforms play a slightly different role.
Look, indeed. And does that present unique challenges for us with the survey? I mean, how do we incorporate that now and track that? I mean, and when I think about ongoing questions we have about sort of tracking brand recognition and things like that, I mean, what are the types of impacts do you think that it might have on the way that we actually continue to track news consumption?
I think it will change things. And I think that it's always been hard to measure news consumption, and researchers have always had to sort of be quite conscious of the limitations of the methods we use. And in some ways, it's become even harder in the last few years. So one reason for this is that it's harder to measure what we call off-site news consumption compared to when people sort of visit a branded news website like The Guardian, for example. We can passively track in some cases, what people are doing online with their consent. But whereas if people are sort of encountering news content on a different site, such as on a social media platform, for example, we can't necessarily sort of see what people are actually accessing when they're there. We have the option of asking about it in a survey as we do here. But some of our other work has shown that when news is consumed offsite, people find it harder to remember and then sort of convey that information in the survey. And you can see how, in a world where news consumption is, at least in part, sort of mediated by generative AI, or perhaps, sort of generative AI responses are used to deliver the news, it might be even harder for audiences to know where that news has come from and to remember it.
Indeed. And there seems to be the other challenge as well of the increasing number of alternative news and information sources out there. And that in a survey, it's very hard to capture them all. You can't ask about every single alternative news outlet out there. Do you see that as an increasing challenge for the project?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we in the report this year, we also have a chapter on influencers and sort of individual personalities and sort of news creators. They're not always creating news, but they're often commenting on the news. And that's in addition to the kind of long tail of alternative news outlets, we also have to start to think about individuals and individual journalists, and the fact that people can go direct to the sort of social media pages of individual journalists and get news that way. And that is something that we can already start to see people doing. And in a sense, that makes tracking where people get their information from even harder as well.
So given all of this change, are there future areas of news consumption that we're thinking about tracking?
I mean, I think generative AI is top of mind for many. I mean, on the one hand, you've got the use of generative AI in the newsroom, but I think there's the other part of that is the use of generative AI to actually get news and how audiences might use it. And I mean, we know that this isn't something that is widespread at the moment. And, there's a sort of question of whether people will get into the habit of using sort of chat bots to sort of get the news. But then, of course, you have to think about how generative AI might be incorporated into products and sort of services that people already use. And I think that might be where sort of generative AI has a sort of biggest impact on people's news consumption.
Okay. Well, look, it's going to be fascinating to keep researching this radically changing space. Thanks so much for your time, Richard, and for your leadership on this really important global project. And thanks everyone for listening. If you want to find out more about the Digital News Report, please go to the link in the show notes. Thank you very much for your company, and bye for now. This podcast was proudly produced by the University of Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. A big thanks to Rach White for her production, the Digital News Report Australia team, all of our interviewees, and Dilika Patharatna for organising it all. If you want to find out more about the Digital News Report Australia, please go to the link in the show notes. This podcast series, The News Now, by the News and Media Research Centre and UCFM. We hope you enjoy listening.